Awesome. Thank you, Dan. As introduced, my name's Nick Volesky. I work for our USU Extension Integrated Pest Management program. So a lot of my experience is evolved in commercial vegetable production, plant pathology, entomology, pesticide application and safety, and of course, general IPM. So I've been tasked to talk about all the problems we have with our cucurbit pest. And unfortunately, there's a lot of them. So from the past few years, from my own scouting, from inquiries from farmers, home gardeners, and samples submitted to our plant diagnostic lab, I've kind of grouped them all into three categories. Some that are very common that we see causing significant damage, some that are somewhat common, and some that I'll see time to time, but they're uncommon and their severity isn't that big of a deal. And I don't have time to go over all of these things, but I highlighted 10 that I think are interesting enough to go over. So the first one is aphids. Aphids, there's several different species of aphids. There's a few that can affect our cucurbit crops, but I wanted to talk about the melon aphid specifically. This is the most common one that will affect our cucurbits, along with some other hosts. But as you guys know, aphids are really, really small. They're about 1 to 1.5 millimeters big. They're a problem season long, especially when we have our vegetable crops out. And the melon aphid, the colorations can vary from kind of a light yellow to a darker yellow to a really dark green that almost looks black. And like all other aphids, they have these tailpipe structures called cornicles. And then unlike other aphids whose antennae are long and slender like this, the melon aphids, they have kind of horn looking antennae, which is an interesting characteristic. And aphids, they're going to overwinter in the egg stage on winter. They're going to overwinter on woody hosts. So this can include catalpa trees or the rose of Sharon. And then in the springtime, when all females will hatch and they will reproduce asexually, like shown in this photo. And wing forms of aphids can actually come about when the colony size gets too big or there's a change in temperature that they need to migrate to a new host. So melon aphids can feed using their piercing, sucking mouth parts. So they'll bite into the plants, and this can potentially cause distorted growth, decreased yield, and reduced quality of yield, and prematurely ripened fruit. So here's two photos that I've taken. This first one is on a squash leaf, and you can see a large colony of the dark form of the melon aphid feeding on this flower, which could prevent it from blossoming and producing into a new fruit. And then this next one is a colony of the yellow form. This was on the underside of a pumpkin leaf that a grower brought in. So all aphids will excrete this honeydew, sticky substance. So if you find this on the bottom of your plant foliage or any parts of the plants, that's a good indicator of a sign or symptoms that you have an aphid problem. So honestly, aphids themselves, their feeding damage isn't really that significant. What we're more concerned is the spread of viruses. So in our cucurbits, there are several different viruses we can get. The cucumber mosaic virus, papaya ring spot, squash mosaic, watermelon mosaic, and zucchini yellow mosaic. In Utah, I've most frequently tested for watermelon mosaic virus. And then last year, I've actually tested a few plants for the cucumber mosaic virus. So aphids are a vector for all of these viruses, with the exception of squash mosaic virus, which is vectored by the cucumber beetle. And sometimes, but really rarely, these viruses can be transmitted through seeds. So again, remember the aphids have a piercing, sucking mouth part. So they're going to bite into a plant and then they can spread it to other plants. So think of it like sharing a needle. That's how the disease can spread. The symptoms of viruses will usually begin to show in, I would say, mid to late June, especially along the edges of your field. And then as aphids continue to move across the field, so will that virus. So the symptoms can vary from plant to plant, and even different parts of the plant. The most common thing that you'll see is on the foliage, where the leaves are clearly discolored and distorted. There's almost kind of this bubbly texture, and the leaves are curling upward. And this shouldn't be confused with herbicide damage. Here's some zucchini where the texture is really bumpy. This is or kind of like warts on it. So this is another symptom. And this one's kind of cool that I've actually seen this on pumpkins and watermelons frequently, where this necrotic, or not necrotic, but more target-like lesions form on the rinds of the fruit. So this is kind of a bizarre, interesting looking symptom of the watermelon mosaic virus. So unfortunately, when your plant gets infected with a virus, there's no cure. There's not a whole lot you can do. Therefore, our management and prevention should be focused on aphids. So how we can manage them, if you just have a few plants or you're a home gardener, which I know some of you said you are, simply spraying a strong stream of water on the colonies that you find can help knock down their population. If you have a large field, I always recommend the yellow sticky traps. This will help monitor for aphids and a lot of other pests, honestly, especially the wing forms that might be migrating into your site. Avoid planting vegetable crops near your overwintering host, like I talked about. At the end of the season, this will be a theme, but removing and destroying plant debris. So disking your fields immediately after harvest, destroy alternate plant hosts, and that will help reduce the aphid and virus source. And then, of course, we want to encourage natural enemies. There's a lot for aphids, like parasitic wasps, the larvae of syrphid flies, lady beetles, and lacewing larvae. And there are pesticide, both synthetic and organic options available if you feel that the aphid problem has reached a threshold and you're noticing the spread of the virus. A lot of synthetic pyrethroids, carbamates, and organophosphates work well. But of course, you want to be mindful when spraying to avoid harming the populations of these beneficials. So the next one I have is damping off. This is super common early in the season, especially when you're starting your seeds indoors in a greenhouse. And damping off is just kind of a generic name for a variety of soil-borne pathogens, like species of Pythium, Rhizocotonia, Fusarium, and Pythothera. And basically what happens is these soil-borne fungi will kill seedlings that are just beginning to germinate or only have been growing for a few days. And once the seed is planted and watered, these fungal spores that are present in the soil or the mycelium, they'll start to colonize within that soil tray. And then the spores, they have these hair-like structures called flagella, and they use that to propel themselves toward the host plant. So here's kind of a graphic of where it's infecting the plant. And once it infects the plant, it's going to kill off the cambium tissue in the root. So here's a photo of what that looks like in cucurbits. Here you can see at the soil level where this tissue has just died back. So this plant's not going to make it. Here's a close-up image. And here's a whole tray where the cucurbits have fell victim to damping off. So if I was this grower, I would just throw out this whole tray. It's not going to work out for them. The best way we can manage and prevent damping off is have a clean, sterile space you're growing in, whether this is in a greenhouse or you're even indoors. Always source new trays or pots, if you are using old ones, make sure you disinfect them thoroughly. Source quality potting mix that's free of pathogens. And if infection occurs, the seedling should be disposed of immediately. And then, of course, use quality, clean water. And if you do find a plant or seedling that has stamping off, go ahead and throw it out and remove the ones around it. And then, of course, keep your seedlings big and healthy. And then what I always do is I like to buy seeds that are pre-treated with fungicides. So Thurum is a common example. And I usually direct sow mine into the field. So I like to use these to give them a fighting chance when they're germinating. And if you are working in a greenhouse, there are drenches you can use, fungicide drenches. So I listed some active ingredients there that you can consider. So powdery mildew is another common one. So powdery mildew overwinters in fruiting structures on plant debris. And when the temperature is warm in the late spring, a secondary spore called a conidia will blow and land on the leaf tissue, like shown here, and cause the infection. So unlike what you think of with other fungi, it does not thrive in wet conditions. Rather, it thrives in high humidity amongst the plant canopy itself. So not the whole environment, or not the whole climate, but the plant canopy, which is common with cucurbits because they have really thick plant canopies, right? After the infection, the powdery mildew. So I put a graphic here. I won't go into the details of the physiology of this, but essentially the cycles of spore production will continue all summer long and find new plants to infect. And then when the temperature is cool in the late summer, the fungus will switch to producing conidia structures, or from producing conidia to producing fruiting structures that will contain the spores that allow for winter survival. So these pictures here show the progression of powdery mildew. Early in the season, you might notice these small little circular patches of the mildew, but as the season goes on, they'll begin to spread. And usually by August, September, you might find cucumber plants where the entire leaf is just infected with the powdery mildew. So fortunately, this can be easy to avoid, especially if you're out there early in the season scouting, looking for those early stages. There are resistant varieties available for squash and cucurbits. If you look at the seed catalogs or the seed packet labels, they will tell you if they have some resistance. And then again, with the theme, always have good sanitation. So remove or plow under infected plant material after harvest. This is really important to prevent it from overwintering. And a lot of the other presenters talked about having good plant spacing. This will help reduce powdery mildew, because it allows better air movement amongst the plant canopy. And then, of course, if you do have an outbreak, there are fungicides options available. So I listed some active ingredients here. And along with the slides for this presentation, I also included a link to our fungicide tables where I list all the products, the active ingredient, interval days, and the brand name of the product as well. So that's a good item for you to reference. Okay, so European earwigs. This is one that you guys are probably all familiar with. They're very easy to identify. They have long, slender bodies. They're brown. They're about 13 to 14 millimeters long, and they're omnivores. So they'll feed on fungi, plants, and other insects. So they'll start as eggs, they'll hatch, they'll develop through different instars till they reach adulthood, looking like this. And they have these prominent pair of pinchers, but they're not actually pinchers. They're technically called cerci on the rear of their body. So in the Western United States, the European earwig has 2 or more generations per year, and then the populations tend to build their highest density in the late summer, which I've definitely seen here in Utah. So This is what some characteristic feeding damage of earwigs looks like. You'll see this on a variety of plants, but not just cucurbits. They'll just skeletonize the foliage. And this can be especially damaging to newly germinating plants. So here you can see all of the true leaves just got destroyed. Here's an older plant where the earwigs went hard on. And then over here was just newly ones where they basically just clipped it off. So it won't even grow at this point. So what I recommend for small acreage or home gardeners is the bait trap technique. So essentially you use like a plastic container or a metal tin can and you bury it into the soil so it's level with the surface, and then put an oil in there. I like to use canola oil, and then add some sort of smelly substance like soy sauce, which I use, fish or clam oil, or bacon grease. And if you want, you could also put a lid on it with punched holes, because aphids like really dark, tight places to go, especially during the daytime. And depending on how many earwigs you have, you might have to change this trap out daily or every couple days, but just make sure you're staying off of it or staying on top of it. And this will really help knock down earwig populations. So a lot of presenters have been talking about plastic mulch. It's a great tool. I use it for our demonstration farms, but I do find that it can be a problem because, again, earwigs like that dark, tight, moist place. So this plastic mulch provides the perfect environment for earwigs. So when I'm placing the traps, I usually place it right up against the mulch to kind of help alleviate that population. If you are a commercial grower and you have cucurbits that, and maybe you aren't using mulch, there are pesticide options as well. Pyrethrin, carbaryl are some of the common ones. Okay, everyone's favorite is the squash bugs. So if you guys aren't familiar with it, you should be, but this is what they look like. They're a true bug. They have wings that are folded flat over their back. They're about 1.5 centimeters big, and they have this triangular shape on their back. So that's kind of a identifying characteristic. And they also have these kind of light brown stripes along the edges of their abdomen. They will lay these shiny bronze, orange colored legs in clusters, usually on the undersides of the leaves in the mid-springs. And these eggs will hatch. The first instar, it's a bright green color, but as it develops through the different stages, they'll begin to resemble the adult more. So squash bugs overwinter in the adult stage, outdoors in protected sites. So this could be like wood piles or other debris. And then once they emerge in the spring, the adults will fly to the host plant. They will feed, mate, lay their eggs, and then continue that generation. So in Utah, in northern Utah, we have about one generation, and then in southern Utah, it's about one and a partial second generation. So squash bugs are a problem because they have this long, piercing, sucking mouth part. So you'll usually find the adults congregated at the base of the plant, and they're going to feed into the stem, and that's going to disrupt the xylem and phloem flow within our plant. So you might see something like this, where it looks like our squash is thirsty, but really it's just wilting because it's been fed on by these squash bugs. So this is a good sign of squash bug damage. Later in the season, as the populations build up, they can congregate on other parts of the plants, including the fruits, and they might feed on the rinds as well. So to manage them, the best thing you can do, Josh talked about that he does this at his farm, is removing the debris at the end of the season, keeping your site free of trash or wood that can serve as that overwintering site. If you just have a small garden or a few plants, I think it's a good idea just to manually go plant to plant and remove and destroy these egg clusters. Trellising is an option if you have a garden site. Um, Unfortunately, there are no cucurbit varieties that are totally immune or resistant to squash bug, but there are some that have shown to have lower susceptibility, like butternut and royal acorn. For a couple years, our program did some demonstration trials using trap crops. We planted the blue Hubbard squash because this has been shown in studies and literature to be more attractive to squash bugs. So we had a pumpkin field where we planted these on the border, and we did find higher squash bug numbers on the blue Hubbard squash. So we were able to only spray on the blue Hubbard squash as opposed to the whole field, and that gave us some good control. There is a natural enemy of the squash bug. We can't totally rely on it for control. It's a specific species of taconid fly. So if you ever find a squash bug with these little white bumps on it, you can just go ahead and let it be, because this is the eggs of this fly and it's in the parasitism process. A lot of our commercial growers will spray for squash bugs, and this is a good method if your timing is spot on. So I always recommend a couple weeks or pretty soon after you initially transplant your cucurbits, or if they're germinating, if you direct sowed, and just spray at the base of the plants to target that overwintering adult stage that has come there. And that could really help knock them down before they even lay eggs. If you miss that window, you can do it later on when the new nymphs have just hatched. That's a good life stage to try to hit them with the spray. There's a lot of products out there. I've used cypermethrin and malathion. So again, in that link, I also have insecticide options that you can use for squash bugs if you are a commercial grower. Okay, spider mites. So spider mites are microscopic. They're less than 1 millimeter big. They're kind of a generalist pest of a lot of our agronomic crops and fruit crops and landscape ornamentals. The two-spotted spider mite specifically has these distinct spots on it. A single generation can be completed in as few as 10 to 14 days during the hot summer periods. 8 or more generations can occur in a year. So here's a close-up of some of the damage we see on our cucurbit crops. So here's the underside of the leaves. I don't know if you can tell, but you can see the spider mites crawling around. You can see the feeding damage. We call it stippling, where they just kind of bite into various parts of the plants, and there's enough of them that it's noticeable. Large populations, you can start to see this webbing from the spider mites. And then here's some of that stippling damage I talked about, but on the cucumber fruit itself. So spider mites love unhealthy and drought-stressed plants. So you want to make sure your plants are well irrigated and healthy to avoid them. If you are a small gardener, similar with the aphids, you could just spray a strong stream of water on the populations to help knock them down. If your farm site has a gravel road or dirt road adjacent to it, especially in the heat of the summer, avoid driving fast and kicking up a bunch of dust, because that'll get on your plants, and spider mites love the dusty conditions. There are beneficials like predatory mites. There's the spider mite destroyer, which is a small little beetle related to ladybugs. And then a lot of other generalist ones like lacewings will feed on spider mites. Spider mites can develop resistance to insecticides. So if you do feel like the threshold is needed, you can apply different miticide products. Okay, so Cody kind of already talked about herbicide and herbicide damage, so I'll skip over that for time. The next one I want to talk about is Fusarium crown foot rot. I've also seen it called Fusarium root rot. But this is caused by a specific species or form of Fusarium solani. So this is a soil-borne pathogen. It causes fruit rot to cucurbits, and there's actually two races of it. So the inoculum it's most commonly in the soil. Sometimes it can come from seed, not as common. Where the fruit, so this happens later in the season where the fruit rests on moist soil, the mycelial growth and dry rot can be more evident. But plants can also become infected at any point. The first symptom is usually noticed in the field is the wilting of the leaves, and then within several days, the plant may wilt and die. If the soil is removed around the base of the plant, you'll see very distinct necrotic rot of the crown and upper portion of the taproot. So there's this poor farm down the state that I've gone to every year. We've confirmed the Fusarium solani in the field. And this is kind of a good picture of where you can see the damage. So see how the soil is kind of wet in just this specific spot. These were all the plants that tested positive for the Fusarium solani. So that moisture is allowing that soil-borne pathogen to spread. So unfortunately, there's nothing to do to save these plants. Here's an image of that crown part of the plant I was talking about, where you can just see it's completely rotted away. So another soil-borne disease is verticillium wilt. This is caused by Verticillium dahliae and Verticillium alboatrum. So these are also soil-borne pathogens. And sadly and annoyingly, these pathogens can be present in the soil for several years in these hard balls of mycelium called microsclerotia. And the ideal temperature for infection is between 70, 85 degrees. And under these temperatures, along with the wet soil, the microsclerotia will germinate. The fungus will infect the plant through intact or damaged root. And then from there, the hyphae will invade the xylem tissue and produce spores that are transported upward through the vascular tissue. So similar to the Fusarium solani, the plant will wilt and die, and then the fungus will produce that microsclerotia that's released in the soil when the plant decays. So here's what that looks like. So here's an infected plant. You can just see the whole thing's dying back. This is a cross section of that crown going into the main root, where you can see the fungi has just completely destroyed this cambium tissue and rotted it out. And then another above ground symptom is in the foliage, where the margins of the leaf will turn brown and necrotic, and then it'll just eventually move up the whole leaf. So you can also see that in this photo as well. So when we manage these soil-borne diseases, couple things we can do. If you guys saw Wesley Crump's talk on Tuesday, he talked a lot about crop rotation. So that's really effective if you work in a large field. You want to source disease-free seed because sometimes it can be spread through the seed, though it's uncommon. And some other growers or some other presenters talked about good sanitation, cleaning off your shoes, tools and equipment when moving from one field to another. In places where you know you have the disease, you can plant cultivars that are labeled to have resistance to various diseases of Fusarium and Verticillium. Of course, remove infected plant material at the end of the season. There are some studies using cover crops in the mustard family, because those have been shown to have some biofumigation properties due to the high presence of glucosinolates. And there's also the option to graft plants. So if there's a variety you want that's resistant, you can use that as the scion and graft it onto a rootstock that has resistance. Okay, so I'm almost out of time, but the last thing I want to mention is our resource. So this is a really awesome website that you should have bookmarked on your phone, extension.usu.edu/pest. Here you can find our guidebooks, video tutorials, fact sheets, and you can send samples or photos to our diagnostic services to solve your problems.